Hey everyone, Duke here, and I just wanted to make a quick video on bait and switch and the upcoming nerf to it. I've had a couple questions on the stream this week asking if bait and switch is still going to be good, if it's going to be bad, if it's going to still be the best. If you didn't already know, bait and switch is going to be getting nerfed from a 35% damage bonus to a 30% damage bonus here in about a week and a half. So in this video, we're going to go over this change. So if you weren't already aware, bait and switch basically requires that you do damage with all of your weapons in order to proc this buff, and it's going to last for 10 or 11 seconds if you have the enhanced version. And again, as of right now, gives you a 35% damage buff. It's going to be a 30% damage buff into the future. Now there's a couple important tidbits about bait and switch. The first one is that it does not work on your first shot. So your first shot is actually getting a 0% damage buff, and that's actually going to be a very important part of this change and kind of the math behind it. So let's go over that. So starting on your first shot, you're going to have a 0% damage buff on that. Again, we just talked about it. You're not getting any extra damage off of your first shot with bait and switch. Once you get to your second shot, again, we're going to go over future numbers, not current numbers. Well, actually, let's go over current numbers first, just because that'll kind of show the difference. So as of right now, that'd be a 35% damage buff on your second shot, another 35% damage buff on your third shot, another 35% damage buff on your fourth shot. Now, again, you're getting 35% on each of those shots. So something important with bait and switch is you cannot re-proc bait and switch while it is currently active. And so that's makes it a little bit trickier to use. I know bait and switch as a perk is considered a somewhat trickier to use perk just in general. I think once you've gotten used to it, it's not so bad, but it's not so set and forget. It's not just shoot the boss and you have a damage buff, or like pick up an orb and you have a damage buff. It's a little bit more intricate, a little bit more tricky. You got to be paying attention. I'd say in 99.9% of cases, unless you're really kind of screwing up the combos, you should be able to get 3 shots of bait and switch, like, the first shot plus 3 shots buffed with bait and switch. That should not be an issue. I think if you are a little bit more experienced and you have a little bit more, understanding of the timing and stuff like that, you should be able to probably get a 4th shot off as well, which again in this case is going to get you to 140% total damage buff in the old bait and switch. So let me note that here. This is old bait and switch. Now again, note from here, whenever it is, whether it be after your 4th total shot or after your 5th total shot, you would then have to re-proc bait and switch, so you would again get no damage buff on that next shot. Now with new bait and switch, again, the same rules are going to apply. We're going to have no damage buff on the first shot. We'll have 30% total after the second. We'll have 60 after the third. We'll have 90 after the fourth. And again, if you're able to get that if you're able to get that 5th shot or 4th total shot off with bait and switch active, you'll be up to 120%. So you can see, obviously just on these numbers, that it is going to add up little by little over, 2 shots, 3 shots, 4 shots. But the thing that's important isn't necessarily the difference between old bait and switch and new bait and switch. The difference is between what the new bait and switch buff is going to look like and probably what's considered the next best perk, or a very close perk even as it is, and that's going to be Explosive Light. Now, Explosive Light, if you're not already aware, can stack up to 6 times with your normal trait. If you do have the enhanced version, it can stack up to 7 times, and every time you pick up an orb, you're going to be able to hold a stack for Explosive Light. And all those stacks, all you have to do, once you have those stacks, is shoot your rocket. Every single rocket you shoot is going to be a 25% damage buff, again, up to 6 times normally, 7 times with the enhanced trait. So again, going over our kind of spreadsheet of damage, I guess, our first shot is going to be a 25% damage buff. Our second shot is going to be 50% total. We're going to have 75% after the third. We'll have 100 after the fourth, and then 125 after the 5th. So taking a quick look at the old bait and switch and potentially why it was better than Explosive Light, we can see these numbers, right? So even if you only got 4 total shots or 3 shots with bait and switch, you're at 105% versus 100%. It was already better. If you're able to get that 4th shot procced with bait and switch, getting 140% total damage versus 125%, it was even more better. Now with just that 5% nerf per shot, comparing the new bait and switch to now Explosive Light, as it has been and still will be, we can see that every single number here is actually lower than Explosive Light. So obviously your first shot, Explosive Light is better. Your second shot, Explosive Light has done more total damage. Third shot, every shot through, Explosive Light has done more total damage. Now there's a couple things we need to talk about here that aren't just spreadsheet numbers and, what these numbers are showing. These numbers do maybe lie in a little bit of in some cases here. And so the first one is explosive light and making sure you have enough orbs. I feel like, if you're doing a raid boss, you're doing a dungeon boss, you're going to be able to have enough orbs before damage phase. You just, again, that is a little bit, you do have to think about it. Make sure you are picking up orbs before the damage phase so that you do have your hopefully 6 or 7 if you're running an enhanced version before the damage phase starts. Now, for Apex Predator at least, if you're running with reserves, you're going to be able to rally with 9 total shots. So even with the enhanced version, you're missing 2 shots. Now, again, in most cases, you're doing a dungeon, you're doing a raid, you probably have somebody on well, on bubble, on a tether, something that's going to be able to create orbs instantaneously at the very start or during a damage phase. So as long as you're picking up, 2 to maybe 3 orbs during the damage phase, if you are shooting out all 9 rockets, you'll still be able to get that damage buff on every single rocket. But it is something to keep in mind if you're shooting even a single shot that is not buffed by an orb for explosive light, that's going to change these numbers. The second thing to talk about is more on the bait and switch side. Again, as we talked about earlier, bait and switch does require, a combination of using all of your weapons. So kind of like with explosive light, if you don't have an orb picked up, then you don't get a damage buff. Here, if you mess up the order or you don't reproc it, like this is only through your first kind of rotation, right, of bait and switch. At some point, if you're going to be shooting out all 9 rockets, you are going to need to reproc bait and switch, and then that's going to change things again. And if we go, go all the way through, again, if let's just say we have 9 total rockets from Apex Predator, we can see the numbers here. And actually, I already messed this up, right? Because this somewhere you're going to be getting a 0% damage buff in here. Like whether it's at this shot or whether it's at this shot, it doesn't really matter. The numbers will still end up being the same. Technically, if you aren't able to, if you had to reproc bait and switch a third time, then the numbers might actually be even a little bit lower. But with what we're looking at here, it'd be 210 total percent. If we look at explosive light, we go to 150, we go to 175, we go to 200, and we go to 225. So it's still pretty similar in terms of again, we're a little bit above on explosive light, a little bit below on bait and switch, but it's close enough where, again, messing up on either side is going to make the other one better. But obviously, if you don't optimize your DPS, then DPS optimization doesn't matter anyway. So they're close. Again, the short version of all of this math here is they're definitely close, but it has definitely been shifted from close but more on bait and switch's side to close but more on explosive light side based on these numbers only. Now, the last thing we need to talk about, and potentially the most important thing, is actually Gjallarhorn. Now, again, will you always have Gjallarhorn on your team? In a raid, probably. In a dungeon, maybe. If you're doing anything solo, no. So it is a little bit dependent on your situation, right? But Gjallarhorn, obviously, or maybe not obviously, includes Wolfpack rounds. So anytime you are using any legendary rocket and somebody on your team is using Gjallarhorn, that's going to allow your legendary rockets to apply Wolfpack rounds and basically do extra damage to whatever you're shooting. Now, what's important about Wolfpack rounds in our math here is that Wolfpack rounds do buff bait and switch. They are buffed by bait and switch. However, explosive light is not buffed by Wolfpack rounds, or Wolfpack rounds are not buffed by explosive light. So basically, you're getting that extra damage from the Wolfpack rounds themselves with bait and switch. However, you are not getting that extra damage with the Wolfpack rounds themselves from explosive light. Now, the thing with Gjallarhorn and Wolfpack rounds is it's actually very inconsistent in terms of how much extra damage it's really applying and how often the Wolfpack rounds are actually hitting and doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. It's very inconsistent. From everything I've been able to research, I've seen anywhere from a 20% to 30% damage buff, basically, when you have a Gjallarhorn with Wolfpack rounds on your team. So we'll use the high end just because that's going to help bait and switch out more, as that's kind of where we're trying to even out here. But 20 to 30%. Now, again, that's not a 20 to 30% damage buff. That's a 20 to 30%, because obviously if you're using Gjallarhorn, it's giving both bait and switch and explosive light 20 to 30% more damage. The rocket itself, the actual damage itself, we're only really looking at the bait and switch part as an additional 20 to 30%. So it's really 20 to 30% of 30% that we're looking at. So 20 to 30% of 30% is somewhere between 6 and 9%, but with some of the inconsistencies of Wolfpack rounds, let's just go ahead and say it's about 5% total of an extra damage buff comparatively. So if we look at Bait and Switch with Galley, we can go ahead and add that 5% damage per rocket, and we will notice that Bait and Switch then becomes eventually quite a bit better than Explosive Light. Obviously on your first shot, maybe your second shot, it's still a little bit lower. Third shot, it ends up being equivalent. But then your fourth shot and past that, you're going to kind of skyrocket ahead of Explosive Light. Again, it's going to be a little bit dependent on exactly how much damage you're actually getting from Galley here. But, you know, by the time you get to that ninth shot, even at just 5% extra damage per rocket, you're going to be quite a bit ahead of Explosive Light. Now, as has been the case a couple times in this video, these numbers are still kind of lying. Because, first of all, you have to have a galley on your team. Again, if you're solo, obviously, you're not going to have a galley. If you're doing, you know, a lower person activity, you know, a dungeon or a three-person activity, you're not going to have a galley. Now, on top of that, if you do have someone with galley, and even like in a three-person activity, that person is not running Bait and Switch. That person is not running Explosive Light. They're running galley. And galley itself is doing significantly less damage than one of these Apex Predator rockets can do. So you're swapping out a high damaging rocket for a much lower damaging rocket just to buff the other people's damage. So in a case where everybody has, you know, the god roll of god rolls of rockets, everybody has a crafted Apex Predator in a low person activity where you don't have as many people that you're buffing with the Gallahorn, got to keep that in mind. Again, in a raid setting where if you have a galley and then 5 people with Apex Predator rockets, now you're buffing 5 people's damage, and that's going to be a lot more impactful than only buffing 2 people's damage, or if you're doing it only with 2 people, you're like 1 person's damage. That is something incredibly important to keep in mind versus just directly individual damage numbers. So my super like 2-sentence TLDR on this entire video is, all else being equal, just on average, Explosive Light is going to be a little bit better than Bait and Switch moving forward. However, if you have a galley on your team, Bait and Switch is still going to be better. Again, I wouldn't necessarily force a galley on your team if you're just doing like a dungeon or something because you are losing out on that person's damage a ton. But if they don't have a great rocket but they do have galley, that's then going to make your rockets better. So keep that in mind as well. If you have the galley, Bait and Switch. If you don't have the galley, Explosive Light. And in general, as I always say, both of these things, if you have either one of them, is going to be extremely, extremely good. You'll be able to beat literally all content in the game. You're having probably 95% of people, 99% of people in terms of like having, you know, the really high-end gear that's going to make things a little bit easier for you. As I always say, you don't really absolutely have to have the actual perfect thing to be able to beat anything in the game. If you're doing like solo flawless Nezarec, like some people are doing, you know, the absolute gods of the world that are doing insanity, sure, then yeah, no, maybe you need the perfect thing. But if you're just doing a raid of any type, normal, master, doesn't matter, any challenge, any of that, easily doable with either of these rockets. And honestly, even significantly worse rockets than these, you can definitely do those activities. Oh, and one final note, if you made it to the very, very, very end of this video, you get a bonus piece of information. Cataclysmic obviously also has Bait and Switch, another really meta, really strong weapon. It's still the best, by far. It's not close. So if you're running Cataclysmic, you still want Bait and Switch for sure, easily. And that's all for today. I hope this video was interesting and helpful. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.